The day after we buried my father, my stepmother changed the locks on the house I grew up in. She left my childhood things in 6 trash bags on the porch, in the rain. She told me, through the door, that the house was hers now, and that I had no claim to anything, and that I should have been kinder to her if I wanted to be remembered. What she didn't know is that my father had spent the last quiet year of his life getting ready for exactly this. And 3 days before he died, he mailed one last letter. By the time she changed those locks, it was already too late for her to stop what was coming. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't bang on the door. I didn't scream at her through it. I picked up my wet trash bags, I put them in my car, and I drove away. Because I already knew something she didn't. The locks didn't matter. The house was never going to be the thing that saved her, or the thing that sank me. That was always going to be a piece of paper, already in the mail, already gone, already past the point where anyone could call it back. Welcome back to the Daily Confessions. This is the channel for the people who were always the quiet one, the one who didn't make a fuss, the one everybody assumed could be moved out of the way without consequence. The quiet ones keep their receipts. This story is built out of mine. My name is Della Hartmann. I'm 38. I'm a librarian. For 11 years, I've run the local history room at our county library. The quiet room at the back that nobody visits, full of old deeds and town records and probate files, and the kind of paper most people throw away without reading. I spend my days with documents that outlived the people who signed them. A marriage recorded in 1911, a deed transferred in 1949, a will that settled a feud nobody alive remembers. And the thing that room teaches you, the thing I know in my bones, is that paper is patient. People shout and bully and rewrite the story to suit themselves, and they win for a while, the way the loud always do. But a document, filed correctly in the right place, just sits there being true, long after the shouting stops. And when the time comes, it wins, with no expression on its face. I just never thought I'd watch it happen to my own family. I'm telling you that because it's the thing my stepmother got wrong about me, the same way she got everything else wrong. She looked at a quiet woman who shelves books and stamps due dates for a living, and she saw someone harmless. Someone who could be handed a stack of trash bags and a closed door and would simply, sadly, go away. She never once considered that a woman who spends her whole life with the meticulous records of the dead might understand, better than almost anyone, exactly what a single recorded line can do to the living. Because I want you to understand what kind of man my father was, and what kind of woman walked into his life after my mother died. My mother passed away when I was 24. Cancer, slow and cruel, and my father nursed her through every single day of it, learning to do things no one should have to learn, and never once complaining where she could hear. They'd been married 31 years. He was not a dramatic man, my father. He was a retired high school shop teacher who fixed things. He kept his tools labeled and his receipts in shoeboxes by year. He showed love by maintaining things, your car, your bike, the gutter on your house, rather than by saying it out loud. After my mother was gone, he got lost in a way I didn't know how to fix. He rattled around that big old house on Sycamore Street, the house he'd bought as a young man and paid off over 30 years, and he got smaller and quieter every season. So when he met Lorna and started to laugh again, I was glad. I want you to really hear that, because it matters for everything after. I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly glad. I did not see her coming, because I wasn't looking for an enemy. I was looking at my father smiling for the first time in 3 years, and I thought, thank God, someone's brought him back. I would have welcomed almost anyone who did that. And Lorna knew it. Women like Lorna always know exactly which door grief leaves unlocked. Lorna was charming in the specific way that's hard to describe until you've lived next to it. She was warm in public and cool in private. At dinners with my father's friends, she was radiant. She'd touch his arm, laugh at his old jokes, call him my love across the table. Then the door would close behind the last guest, and something in her face would simply switch off like a light. She remembered the names of my father's golf friends and forgot mine for 2 full years, calling me honey and sweetie in a way that sounded affectionate and was actually just a way of never saying my name. She redecorated my mother's house room by room, slowly, over years, so that no single change was ever worth fighting about. And every time a piece of my mother disappeared, a quilt my grandmother had made, a photograph, the good china we'd used every Christmas of my childhood, it was always framed as something gentle. We're just freshening things up. Your father needs a new start, not a museum. You don't want him living in sadness, do you, honey? And what could I say to that? If I objected, I was the cold daughter who wanted to keep her father trapped in grief. So I said nothing. I watched my mother get packed into boxes and carried to the basement, one reasonable-sounding decision at a time, and I told myself it was kindness. That's the thing about people like Lorna. They never take everything at once, because taking everything at once would get them caught. They take it one reasonable piece at a time. Each piece small enough that objecting to it would make you look unreasonable. Until one day you look up, and the whole house, the whole life, belongs to them. And you can't point to the single moment it happened, because there wasn't one. There were 100. They married 2 years after my mother died. I stood at that small wedding in a dress Lorna had suggested I wear, a beige thing that made me disappear into the background of every photo, and I smiled, because my father was smiling. And slowly, over the 6 years that followed, I watched his whole life get quietly rearranged around Lorna's comfort. His old friends stopped coming by. She made them feel unwelcome in a way too subtle to name. Our phone calls got shorter, because she was always somehow in the room. I'd call the house and she'd answer and tell me warmly that Dad was napping, or out, or not up to talking today. "Sweetie, I'll tell him you called." Sometimes I think she did. Often I think she didn't. I'd drive the 2 hours to visit, and she'd hover the entire time, refilling coffee nobody asked for, never quite leaving us alone, until the visit was over and I'd driven 2 hours home, having barely had a real conversation with my own father. I told myself it was fine. I told myself she made him happy, and that my discomfort was just jealousy, just the selfishness of a daughter who didn't want to share her dad. I was the one who never made a fuss, so I didn't make one now either. But I want to be honest about something, because it's the part of me that turned out to matter. I didn't fight, but I noticed. It's what I do. It's what 11 years in a records room makes of a person. Quietly, almost without meaning to, I kept track. The date the quilt disappeared. The Christmas the good china didn't come out. The visits where I drove 2 hours and never got 5 minutes alone with my own father. I didn't write it down to use it. I wrote it down because noticing is the only thing I knew how to do with the helplessness. I just kept showing up, the way I keep doing everything. And I let a stranger stand between me and my father for 6 years, because making a scene felt worse than losing him slowly. I will carry that, but I've made a kind of peace with it because of what my father did with those same 6 years, in secret, where I couldn't see. And because, in my own small way, I'd been keeping records too. Here's the thing I didn't know, the thing that changes this whole story. My father knew exactly what she was. He saw it long before I did. He just didn't say it out loud, because he was a man who hated conflict even more than I do. And because he had decided to handle it his own way, not with a fight, but with paper. Quietly. The way careful men do. Remember that. It's the wall this whole story breaks against. About a year before he died, my father got sick. Heart, mostly, with the kind of diagnosis that gives you time, but takes away the pretense that you have forever. And something shifted in him. I felt it before I understood it. He started calling me more, but not on the house phone where Lorna might answer. On his own cell, the one she'd never bothered to learn the habits of, because in her mind it was just a thing he barely used. He'd call on my drive home from the library, around 6, when he knew I'd be alone in the car with no one to overhear, and we'd talk in a way we hadn't in years. About my mother, about when I was small, about the house and the maple in the backyard he'd planted the year I was born, and how tall it had gotten. And in among the gentle talk, he started saying things that I didn't understand at the time, and that I would replay 100 times later. One evening he asked me, out of nowhere, "You still work with all those old deeds and records down at the library?" I said yes. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, almost to himself, "Good. Good is stronger than a person." I laughed and said something about how only a librarian's father would find that romantic. He didn't laugh. He just said, "I mean it, Della." And then, on what turned out to be one of our last real calls, he said the thing I've built the rest of my life around since. He said, "Della, you've always been the one who keeps things in order. I need you to trust that I've kept some things in order too. When the time comes, and it's coming, sweetheart, let's not pretend. Don't fight in that house. Don't waste your strength on the locks. Don't argue with Lorna over a single dish. Just go home and wait for the mail. Promise me that. Promise me you'll just wait." I thought he was being sentimental. A sick man talking in riddles the way sick people do when they're making peace with things. I said, "Okay, Dad, I promise." I didn't understand that my father, in his quiet, conflict-avoiding way, was telling me he had built something, that he had spent the last of his strength on a plan, and that all he needed from me was the one thing he knew I was good at: staying steady and waiting and trusting the paper. I understand it now. I understand all of it now. But on that night, I just told my dying father I'd do as he asked. I hung up. I cried in a grocery store parking lot. And I had no idea he'd just handed me the key to everything. My father died on a Tuesday in November. It was not a surprise. We'd had a year of warnings, and it was still, somehow, the worst day of my life. The thing nobody tells you about an expected death is that the expecting doesn't help. You think you've spent a year getting ready, and then it happens, and you find out there's no such thing as ready. And Lorna, who had spent 6 years being pleasant in public, did not even wait for the body to be cold before she stopped pretending. At the funeral, she sat in the front row in black that looked expensive, in a hat with a little veil. She accepted condolences from my father's old friends, like a queen receiving her court. Many of them were friends she'd quietly driven away years ago, now back to pay respects, telling her how strong she was being. She introduced herself as his widow, and let the word do its work. She did not save me a seat in the front row. I want you to sit with that for a second. At my own father's funeral, his only child stood off to the side, because his wife of 6 years had arranged the front row for herself and her people, and there was no chair with my name on it. And then I went to hug her, because grief makes you reach for anyone who shares it, even someone you don't trust. She put her cheek near mine, and she said very quietly, in a voice pitched just for me under the organ music, "You'll want to come by this week and get whatever's yours." After that, the house is being handled. Handled. At my father's funeral, with his casket still in the room and the flowers still fresh. I should have understood right then, but I was deep in grief and still the daughter who looks for the kind reading, and I told myself she was overwhelmed, that people say strange things when they're grieving. I drove home from that funeral, and I cried myself to sleep, and the next morning I got up early, the way you do when there's a terrible task ahead of you, and you just want to start it. And I drove the 2 hours to the house on Sycamore Street to begin the impossible work of going through my father's things. And the locks were already changed. I want you to picture this with me, because I lived it, and I'll never forget a detail of it. There were 6 black plastic trash bags lined up on the front porch, the cheap kind, already shining wet because it had started to rain, that fine, cold rain that soaks you slowly. My key, the key I'd had since I was 16, the key to my own childhood, didn't turn. I stood there and tried it twice, stupidly, the way you do when your body won't accept what your eyes are telling you. Through the front window, I could see into the living room, and the mantel was already bare. My mother's last photograph was gone, the one of the 3 of us at the lake when I was 7, the one my father had physically refused to let Lorna pack away, the one thing of my mother's he'd fought to keep in plain sight. Less than 24 hours after we buried him, she'd already taken it down. I knocked. Lorna came to the door, but she didn't open it. She stood on the other side of the glass storm door, in a soft gray sweater, holding a cup of coffee. And she spoke to me through it, the way you'd speak to a stranger who'd knocked to sell you something you didn't want. She told me the house was hers now. She told me my father had wanted her taken care of, that everything was in her name, that I had no legal claim to a single nail in the place. And then she said the thing I will hear in her voice for the rest of my life. She tilted her head, almost gently, and she said that if I'd been a warmer presence in my father's final years, if I'd visited more, called more, been less cold and distant, then perhaps he'd have thought to leave me something. She said it with my mother's house behind her, and my childhood in wet trash bags at my feet, and she said it like advice, like she was doing me a kindness, teaching me a lesson about how I might have done better. And here is the part I'm proudest of in this entire story. Standing on that wet porch, I made a choice. It did not feel like surrender, though I know it might have looked like it from inside that warm house. It was the hardest decision I have ever made on my feet. I made it in about 4 seconds. I did not argue. I did not cry where she could see me. I did not pound on that glass and beg her to remember whose house this was, whose father, whose photograph. Every cell in my body wanted to. I chose not to, because somewhere underneath the grief, in the part of me that keeps the record straight and never makes a scene, I heard my father's voice from those phone calls, as clear as if he were standing beside me. Don't fight in that house. Don't waste your strength on the locks. Just go home and wait for the mail. And I understood, standing there, that walking away was not weakness. It was the first move. The only move that wouldn't blow up the one my father had already made. So I bent down and I picked up my wet trash bags, one at a time. I carried them to my car in the rain. I loaded my whole childhood into the trunk while my stepmother watched me through the glass. I did not look back at her. And I know, because I felt it, even without looking, that as I drove away, her face relaxed. Because in her mind, she had just won. The quiet daughter had come and been turned away and left without a fight. Soaked, silent, and beaten, exactly the way she'd planned it. She had no idea that the single most important object in this entire story was, at that exact moment, sitting in a postal facility 40 miles south of us, already certified, already scanned, already moving toward my mailbox, already so far beyond her reach that nothing she could ever do would call it back. I'll be honest about the days in between, because I don't want you to think any of this was easy or that I floated through it serene. For 2 days, I didn't know for certain that anything was coming. I had my father's strange words, wait for the mail. I had a grief so heavy I could barely stand up under it. And I had 6 trash bags of my childhood I couldn't bring myself to open, sitting in my trunk, because carrying them inside felt like admitting the house was really gone. I slept badly. I lay awake doing the thing I'd promised my father I wouldn't do, which was running through every angry argument I wished I'd made through that glass door. And then I'd hear him again, telling me to be still, and I'd make myself be still. Being still, when every nerve in you is screaming to fight, is the hardest work I know. My father knew that about me. He was asking me for the hardest thing because he knew I could do it. I want to tell you what was actually happening while Lorna thought she was winning. Because this is the part my father built, alone, in the last quiet year of his life. And I didn't fully understand it until it was done. My father, it turned out, had not been napping through all those afternoons Lorna told me he was unavailable. He had been on the phone. With a lawyer. A precise, old-fashioned estate attorney named Walter Mbeki, 2 towns over. A man Lorna had never met and never heard of, because my father had chosen him for precisely that reason. He'd found him in an old address book, a man he'd known slightly decades ago, specifically because he was someone outside the circle of their shared life, someone Lorna couldn't charm or intercept. Over the course of that final year, while everyone assumed he was just a sick old man fading quietly in his chair, my father had been doing something very deliberate. One careful phone call and one quiet office visit at a time. He had discovered something that even he had half forgotten. The house on Sycamore Street, the house Lorna had spent 6 years treating as already hers, the house she'd redecorated and claimed and changed the locks on, was not, in fact, hers. Not on paper. Years earlier, in the fog of grief after my mother died, my father had let Lorna's name drift onto some of the household accounts. The checking account, a utility or two. The small daily things she'd asked for so she could help manage things. But the house itself, the deed, the actual ownership of the actual building, that he had never transferred. He'd meant to, maybe, in some lonely moment when she was pushing. But he never had. Something in him, some quiet instinct he couldn't even explain at the time, had held that one line. And so the deed still said exactly what it had always said. His name. And, in a detail Lorna never thought to check, because why would a woman so sure of her victory go digging in county records? There was a small but decisive instruction. One my father had added years before, back when my mother first got sick, and he started thinking hard about what happens to the people you leave behind. A transfer on death designation. A simple legal line, recorded with the county, that said, "When I die, this house passes directly to my daughter, Della Hartmann." Not through a will that could be dragged into court and contested for years. Not through probate that a clever lawyer could tangle up. Directly. Automatically. The instant his heart stopped beating, by the plain operation of the law, that house became mine. Lorna changed the locks on a house that had legally belonged to me since the Tuesday my father died. But my father, who knew exactly who he had married, didn't stop there. Because he understood something about paper that I understand too. A single document in a drawer can be hidden, or burned, or quietly made to disappear by a grieving widow with the run of the house and a month before anyone comes looking. So he made sure the truth couldn't live only in that house, where Lorna could reach it. In his last month, too weak to drive himself, he had Walter prepare a full set of certified copies. The recorded deed, the transfer on death designation, a long letter in his own hand explaining exactly what he'd done and why, and a clear-eyed, dated account of the things he'd quietly watched Lorna do over 6 years. And 3 days before he died, he had Walter's office mail the entire package. To me. Certified, tracked, time-stamped, beyond recall. That was the letter. That was the mail, he told me, in a grocery store parking lot, to wait for. I want to stop here for a moment because I know some of you are listening to this in a kitchen, or a car, or a quiet house of your own. And I know some of you have a Lorna. Maybe not a stepmother, maybe a sibling, a son-in-law, a friend who has been slowly, reasonably, pleasantly taking pieces of your life for years. And I know the thing you feel because I felt it. You feel like the only way to stop them is to finally explode, to make the scene, to match their nerve with noise. I want you to hear what my father taught me without ever quite saying it. You don't have to. The loud move is rarely the strong one. The strong move is the quiet, deliberate, correct one that they never see coming, because they've already decided you're too soft to make it. It arrived 2 days after Lorna turned me away at the glass. I remember sitting at my own small kitchen table, the trash bags still in my car because I hadn't had the heart to unpack my childhood yet, and opening a thick envelope with my father's lawyer's return address. And I read my father's last letter to me in his own shaky handwriting. And I want to share just the beginning of it with you, because it's the truest thing anyone ever wrote to me. He wrote, "Della, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Lorna has probably already done the thing I expect her to do. I'm sorry I wasn't braver while I was alive. I wasn't strong enough to fight her at the kitchen table, but I was strong enough to do this. The house is yours. It was always going to be yours. I made sure of it in a way she can't undo. Don't argue with her. You don't have to. The paper already has. All you have to do is be the careful, steady girl you've always been, and let the truth I mailed you do the rest." I sat at that table, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral. Not because I was sad, though I was, but because my father, the quiet man who hated conflict, had found the one kind of courage he had in him. He couldn't yell, but he could plan. He couldn't protect me with his voice, protected me with paper, from beyond the grave, 3 days early, in a way no lock could stop. And then I dried my face, and I made the second choice of this story, the one that was mine and not my father's. I decided exactly how I was going to use what he'd handed me, because a letter sitting in your lap is not the same as a house back in your name. Somebody still had to carry it the rest of the way, and that somebody was me. I got methodical. I read every certified page twice. I made a list of what I had and what each piece proved. I drove to the county office and confirmed, with my own eyes and my own professional knowledge, that the deed was recorded exactly the way my father's letter said. I did the work. My father built the door. I was the one who walked through it and turned the key. I did not call Lorna. I want you to understand that this is the whole engine of how a quiet person wins. I did not call her to gloat. I did not drive to the house to wave the deed at the glass, because the thing my father understood, and the thing I understood the moment I read his letter, was that the power was not in telling Lorna anything. The power was in the fact that it was already done. Quietly, completely. 3 days before my father died, while Lorna was still busy planning her victory. There was nothing left to win. It had already been won. So I took the letter and all the certified copies to Walter and Becky's office. And I met, for the first time, the old man my father had trusted with all of it. His office was small and lined with the kind of law books nobody opens anymore, and it smelled like paper and coffee. The moment I walked in, I felt like I'd stepped into a room my father had built for me without my knowing. He was expecting me. He'd been waiting, the way you wait for the last part of a plan you helped a dying man build. He looked at me over his glasses, and his eyes were kind, and he said, "You must be Della. Your father told me you'd come in quietly, without any drama. He said that's how you do everything. He was very proud of that, you know. He said, 'My daughter won't make a scene. She'll just walk in like she's returning a library book, and then she'll fix it.'" I had to sit down when he said that, because it was so exactly my father, and so exactly me, and he'd seen it all from the inside of a year I thought he'd spent fading. Walter walked me through what was already true, slowly, the way you explain something to a person in grief. The house, he said, was legally mine, and it had been from the precise moment of my father's death, Not from the day I'd read the letter, not from the day a court would say so. From that Tuesday in November. Automatically. By operation of law. The transfer on death designation my father had quietly added years earlier had done its work the instant his heart stopped. There had been no window in which the house was ever Lorna's. Not one day. The locks she'd changed, the bags she'd packed, the speech she'd made through the glass, all of it had happened inside a house that already, legally, belonged to me. And then Walter asked me how I wanted to proceed. Not him, me. It was my house, my decision, and he made sure I knew it. I could have told him to come down on Lorna with everything at once. Instead, I made the choice my father would have made, the one that was now mine to make. Do it cleanly. Do it on paper. Give her exactly one chance to leave without a fight. I told Walter to send her a notification, not a threat, so that's what we did. On my instruction, Walter sent her a single letter. It informed her, with copies of the recorded deed and the transfer on death designation attached, that the house was the legal property of Della Hartmann, that she was occupying it without any right, and that she had 30 days to vacate the premises and return all personal property belonging to me and to my father's estate. It was polite. It was precise. And it was, above all, not a thing she could argue her way out of, through a closed glass door, because the argument was already over. It had been over since before my father died. I would love to tell you that Lorna read that letter and quietly packed her bags and left. She did not. People like Lorna never go without a fight the first time, because leaving quietly would mean admitting out loud that the daughter they'd dismissed had beaten them, and that is the one thing they cannot survive. She got a lawyer of her own, and she came back with the only move she had left, which was to attack my father. She claimed the transfer on death was invalid. She claimed my father had been confused at the end, not in his right mind, manipulated. By me, of course. The cold, distant daughter who'd suddenly turned up with paperwork. She claimed the dead man hadn't known what he was doing, and this is the place where a story like mine usually falls apart. Because a determined liar with a lawyer and no shame can drag an honest, grieving person through years of misery, depositions, and legal bills, betting that you'll run out of money or strength or will before they do. If my father had only left me a deed, that's probably how it would have gone. A long, ugly war over whether a dead man had been in his right mind, with no way to ever truly prove it. Except my father had thought of that too. Of course he had. He'd spent a year thinking of everything. Because Walter, on my father's specific instruction, had done one more deliberate thing during that final year, the thing that turned out to matter most of all. Every time my father came in to work on his plan, Walter had quietly built a record of his client's clarity. There was a letter from my father's own cardiologist, dated and signed, stating plainly that his patient's mind was sharp and his judgment sound to the very end. And there was a video, a short one, made in Walter's office, of my father sitting in a chair in a clean pressed shirt, looking straight into the camera, calmly and clearly explaining what he was doing and why. Naming the house, naming me. Naming, with a small, sad smile, exactly what he expected Lorna to try after he was gone. On that video, my father looks straight into the lens. Walter played it for me, and I have watched it more times than is probably healthy. He says, "Lorna's going to say I wasn't in my right mind when I did this. She'll say someone put me up to it. So let me say this plainly, while everyone can see my face and hear my voice. No one put me up to anything. My mind is clear. I know exactly what I'm doing, and exactly who I'm protecting my daughter from. I'm not confused. I'm just finally doing the thing I should have had the spine to do years ago." When Lorna's lawyer saw that video, my father, clear-eyed, naming her game before she'd even played it, and the cardiologist's letter, and the recorded deed, and the certified, tracked, time-stamped mailing sent 3 days before his death, he did what competent lawyers do when their client has no case and a mountain of evidence against them. He stopped advising her to fight and started advising her to leave. I've thought a lot about why my father built it the way he did, with so many separate pieces. And I think it's because he understood that a person like Lorna always has another door to try. So he closed every one of them in advance. She wanted to say the house was hers, but the recorded deed and the transfer on death said it had been mine from the moment he died. She wanted to say he hadn't been in his right mind, but the cardiologist's letter and his own calm face on that video said otherwise. She wanted to say the daughter had cooked it all up after the funeral, but the certified tracked mailing was time-stamped 3 days before he died. She wanted to keep my mother's things, but Walter had the paperwork that said every one of them belonged to the estate. Every door she reached for, my father had already quietly locked, a year before she ever thought to try the handle. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. That's not how it ended, and I've come to think that's the part my father would have liked best. Because a courtroom scene is a fight. My father had spent his whole life avoiding fights, and he'd found a way to win the biggest one of his life without ever raising his voice. It ended in paper, the way he'd built it. The transfer on death held because it was airtight. Lorna's claim of incompetence collapsed the moment her own lawyer watched my father clear and calm on that video predict her exact move from beyond the grave. There was simply nothing left under her. The whole structure she'd spent 6 years building, the redecorating, the intercepted phone calls, the slow erasure of my mother, the confident speech through the glass, turned out to be built on a house that was never hers. And the floor just dropped out of all of it at once. Lorna did not leave the way she'd arrived. There was no graceful exit. She was given a date. The law gave it to her, not me. And on that date, she had to be out of the house she'd been so certain was hers. I'm told her lawyer, after he watched the video, sat her down and explained it in small words. She was no longer a widow defending her home. She was a wrongful occupant of someone else's property. And every day she stayed past the date made things worse for her, not better. The confidence she'd worn behind that glass door did not survive contact with the recorded deed. She vacated within the season. And here is the part that mattered most to me. Before she left, she had to return everything. Not just my childhood things from those 6 trash bags. Everything of my mother's she'd freshened away over 6 years. Walter made her account for it, item by item, on a list she had to sign her name to. The woman who'd told me through a glass door that I had no claim to a single nail in the place signed her name over and over, returning the contents of a house she'd been so sure was hers. I did see her one more time. Not in court, not in a fight, the kind she'd been so ready for at the glass door. In Walter's office, across a conference table, with my father's house key in my hand and the inventory list in front of her. She had to sign beside each item to release it back to the estate, and she did it without once looking up at me. Quilt. China. The good silver. She signed and signed, her pen moving in that neat, controlled hand I remembered from 6 years of her redecorating my mother away. And then she reached the line for the photograph, my mother's last photograph, the 3 of us at the lake, and her pen stopped. Just for half a second, long enough for me to see it land on her, finally, that the quiet daughter she'd put out in the rain had been holding the deed the whole time. Then she signed that too, and pushed the list across the table, and that was the last thing Lorna and I ever did in the same room. I did not go to watch her leave the house. I didn't need to, and watching would have made it about her, and it was never about her. It was about my father, and the things themselves came home. Not just my own childhood things from those 6 trash bags, my mother. The quilt my grandmother had stitched, that Lorna had freshened away to the basement years ago. The good Christmas china, and the photograph. My mother's last photograph. the three of us at the lake, the one Lorna had stripped off the mantel before my father was even cold. It came back to me wrapped in newspaper, in a box. And I sat on my floor and held it and wept. Because my father had reached forward through a whole year of dying to make sure that picture came home. And the house my father bought as a young man, the house my mother died in, the house I grew up in and was turned away from in the rain, came home to me too. Exactly the way he'd planned it, long before Lorna ever changed a single lock. I live there now. It took me a while to be able to. For a few months, I couldn't sleep in it. The grief was too fresh, and the rooms too full of him. But slowly, it became mine in the way it was always meant to be. I finally unpacked those 6 trash bags in my own front room, with my own key in my own door that no one can change on me again. I put my mother's photograph back on the mantel, in the exact spot my father had fought to keep it. And some evenings, I swear the house feels lighter for it. The maple he planted the year I was born is taller than the roofline now. I sit under it sometimes. And on the wall right by the front door, where you see it first thing when you come in, I framed my father's last letter. Not the certified copies, those are in a safe place. The careful way he taught me. The handwritten one. The shaky one. The one where the quiet man told his quiet daughter that he'd finally found the only kind of courage he had in him, and spent all of it on her. Here's the thing my stepmother forgot about me, and about my father. She spent 6 years certain that people like me could be moved out of the way without consequence. She looked at a mild man who hated conflict, and a mild woman who shelves books, and she thought she was dealing with people too soft to stop her. She mistook our quiet for weakness. It was never weakness. My father wasn't soft. He was patient. He didn't fight her at the kitchen table because he was busy winning somewhere she'd never think to look. In a lawyer's office 2 towns over, on a piece of paper, 3 days ahead of her. She changed the locks thinking she'd won. The letter was already in the mail. If you've ever been the quiet one, the one somebody assumed could be pushed aside without a fight, the one who got handed the trash bags and the closed door, hear me. Your quiet was never weakness. Sometimes the truth is already in the mail, already past calling back, and all you have to do is be steady when it comes. If this reached something you've carried, tell me in the comments and subscribe. There's a new confession here every day, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for sitting with me to the end.